Go slow. It hurts." The Chinese woman moaned, her voice a raw whisper against the vast, silent prairie. The cowboy smirked, a grim twist of his lips that might have been mistaken for a smile if you didn't see the pain in his own eyes. "I need you to give me strong boys." The sun was a merciless god, hanging low in the sky, painting the endless grassland in brutal shades of gold and rust. Leanne's feet were a geography of pain, each step leaving a crimson drop on the yellowed stalks of grass. They were raw, bleeding, a testament to how far she had run. Her dress, once a delicate silk the color of cherry blossoms, was now just a collection of rags hanging around her bruised legs. It was a ghost of the woman she was supposed to be. She had been running since before the sun had even thought about rising. Back in Dragon's Peak, in the cramped room behind her father's shop, the world was still asleep. His fretful snores had been the soundtrack to her escape, shaking the thin paper walls, a rhythm of the prison she was leaving behind. Dragon's Peak. The name was a cruel joke. There were no peaks, only the flat, crushing weight of hardship. There were no dragons, only men with cold eyes and heavy hands. Her father, Mr. Wei, a man who measured life in abacus beads and profit margins, had promised her to Mr. Wu. Promised wasn't the right word. Sold. He'd sold her. Mr. Wu's power in their small, suffocating community was as cold and hard as the coins he hoarded in his back room. His fists were like stones. His breath smelled of bitter rice spirits and something rotten beneath. His temper was a flash fire, consuming everything in its path. The wedding was supposed to be tomorrow, or maybe it was today. She didn't know anymore. Time had dissolved into a desperate forward motion. Every aching muscle, every ragged breath was a prayer to a god she wasn't sure even listened. Leanne forced herself onward. Her legs were trembling, threatening to give out. Her throat was a desert, cracked and burning with a desperate thirst. The territory stretched before her, an ocean of grass, impossibly vast, utterly unforgiving. She knew the stories. The dangers whispered in the dark. Wolves with eyes like yellow lamps. Rattlesnakes coiled like braided death in the dust. And the sun, the relentless sun that could cook a man in his own skin, killing as surely as a bullet from a gun. But these were gentle fates. They were clean, honest deaths compared to the life that waited for her back in town. A life in Mr. Wu's bed. A life of quiet, endless suffering. The wind picked up. It carried the scent of sage and dust, and something else. Something that made her heart stop cold. Horse sweat. Leather. They had found her. She stumbled, her legs finally betraying her, and she fell to her knees in the rough grass. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, frantically searching the horizon. But it was empty. Just the endless waving grass and the oppressive, silent sky. And then she heard it. It wasn't the sound she was expecting, not the chaotic noise of a posse of angry men. It was a steady rhythm, the beat of a single horse's hooves. And it wasn't coming from behind her, from the direction of Dragon's Peak. It was coming from the north. A lone rider appeared, cresting a low hill, a perfect dark silhouette against the dying sun. He sat tall in the saddle, moving with his horse as if they were one creature, a motion that spoke of 1,000 miles and a lifetime of riding. As he drew closer, the details sharpened. A weathered hat pulled low, sturdy denim faded by the sun and work. The quiet, assessing set of his shoulders. A cowboy. Leanne's blood ran cold. The stories she'd heard in town were not just of Mr. Wu's cruelty. They were of the white men, the cowboys who rode the plains. The townsfolk spoke of them as demons, creatures without souls or mercy, who saw her people as something less than human, animals to be used or discarded. But as the rider drew nearer, something in the way he held himself made her stay perfectly still. Maybe it was just the exhaustion, a weariness so deep it had burned past fear. Or maybe it was something else, an instinct that ran deeper than the terror that had been drilled into her. He reined his horse to a stop about 20 feet away. He didn't speak. He just studied her. His eyes were as clear and calculating as a winter sky. Leanne braced herself. She waited for him to reach for the rifle she saw slung on his saddle. She waited for the sneer, the casual, brutal cruelty she had been warned about her entire life. Instead, he just sat there, his gaze raking over her. He saw the torn dress, the bloodied feet, the raw panic in her eyes. But he wasn't looking at her with malice. He wasn't looking at her with hunger. He was looking at her with the cool, practical appraisal of a man evaluating livestock at an auction. "You're hurt," he said. His voice was deep, carefully measured. It was a statement of fact, not an offer of sympathy. Leanne tried to answer, to plead, to say something, but only a dry croak came out of her parched throat. She swayed where she knelt, the world turning into a swirl of black spots at the edges of her vision. The cowboy dismounted in one smooth, economical motion. He moved with a purpose that was both intimidating and strangely calming. From a leather satchel on his horse, he produced a water skin. He approached her slowly, cautiously, the way you would approach a skittish horse that might bolt at any sudden move. He didn't offer it to her gently. He didn't hold it to her lips. He thrust it toward her, a simple, non-negotiable gesture. Leanne's hands shook so badly she could barely take it. The water was warm from the sun, but it was clean, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. She drank greedily, desperately, until he pulled it back with a firm, steady hand. "Slow," he cautioned. His tone was flat, brooking no argument. "Too much will make you sick. A sick woman's no use to anyone. No use to anyone." The words hung in the air between them. Up close, she could see him properly. Sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw, all weathered by years of sun and wind. His eyes were startlingly pale, and they held none of the leering hunger she had grown so accustomed to seeing in the faces of men. There was no lust there. There was something harder, a grim pragmatism, a grave assessment. It was as if he wasn't reading her story, but calculating her potential utility, her worth. "Please," Leanne finally managed to whisper. The word was raw, desperate, torn from the very bottom of her soul. "I can't go back. I can't." He studied her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he looked back the way she had come, toward the distant, hazy smudge on the horizon that was Dragon's Peak. "Men following you?" She nodded, the simple movement sending a fresh wave of pain through her exhausted body. Fresh tears cut clean tracks through the layers of dust on her face. "My father. Others. They'll make me—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of it was too monstrous to speak aloud. The cowboy stood up, his tall frame blocking out the sun. He scanned the horizon again, his eyes narrowed, searching for something she couldn't see. Whatever he saw or didn't see seemed to make up his mind for him. He moved back to his horse and pulled a thick wool blanket from his pack. Then he unrolled several long strips of soft, supple leather. "Feet first," he said, his voice as flat and uncompromising as the land around them. He knelt again and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated for a second, then complied, her body moving on instinct alone. He began cleaning the wounds on her feet with a rough but surprisingly efficient touch. He didn't say a word, his focus entirely on the task. Leanne flinched at his first touch, her body conditioned to recoil from any contact that didn't bring pain or prelude some new violation. But this was different. It was impersonal, the touch of a craftsman repairing a broken tool. "My name is Garrett," he said, not looking up from his work as he began to wrap her bloody feet in the soft leather strips. "What's yours?" "Leanne," she whispered, the sound barely audible over the wind. "Leanne," he repeated, the sound foreign on his tongue, as if he were tasting a strange and unfamiliar word. He finished wrapping her feet, tying the last knot with a practiced efficiency. Then he looked up at her, his pale eyes pinning her in place. "Where you running to?" It was the question she had been running from herself, the question that had no answer. Where could a woman alone go in this world? She had no money. She had no skills beyond the ones her father demanded in his shop, adding figures on an abacus and serving tea with a bowed head. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice cracking with the terrible truth of it. "Away. Just away." Garrett finished with her feet and sat back on his heels, his gaze unwavering. "Away is nowhere, Leanne. Out here, a woman alone is a dead woman. It's that simple." He looked her over again, his gaze lingering on her small frame, her slender hands, the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "What can you do? Can you cook? Sew? Keep a house?" The questions were blunt, jarring, like stones thrown at her. "Yes," she said, confused by the interrogation. "I can keep accounts. I worked in my father's shop. I'm very good with numbers." "Don't need an accountant," he grunted, the words clipped and final. He stood up, towering over her, and then he extended his hand down to her. It was not an offer of comfort. It was not a gesture of kindness. It was a command. "You come with me. I have a place." Leanne stared at his outstretched hand. It was large, calloused, and stained with the dirt of the land. Every warning she had ever been given, every lesson about the dangers of strange men, screamed at her. The voices of her elders, her father, the whole of Dragon's Peak, rose up in a chorus of fear inside her head. But those were the same voices that had told her to be obedient, to marry where she was told, to accept her lot in life without question. Those voices had led her here, to this exact moment, barefoot and bleeding and broken on the empty prairie. This man, Garrett, he was hard. He was maybe even cruel in his own quiet, practical way. But his cruelty felt different. It felt like the land itself, impersonal, honest, without malice. It was a different kind of danger than the suffocating, smiling hypocrisy of Dragon's Peak. It was a danger you could see coming. She took his hand. His grip was firm, unyielding. He lifted her easily onto his horse, as if she weighed nothing at all. She expected him to swing up behind her, to press his body against hers, but he didn't. Instead, he took the horse's reins and began to walk, leading them north, away from the setting sun, deeper into the vast, darkening landscape. He didn't look back. They traveled in silence as the last of the sun's light bled from the sky, setting the grasslands ablaze in a final, fiery spectacle. As twilight deepened into night, they arrived. It wasn't a town, or even a small settlement. It was a small, isolated ranch, nestled in a protective grove of cottonwood trees. A simple cabin, a sturdy barn, and a corral. It was a fortress of solitude, a self-contained world in the middle of nowhere. It could be a sanctuary, or it could be another kind of cage. She didn't know which was worse. "Rest," he said, his voice a low rumble in the growing dark. He helped her down from the horse, his hands strong on her waist, and then he let go, the distance between them immediately reasserting itself. "I'll make a fire." Leanne limped inside the cabin and collapsed gratefully onto a simple cot in the corner. It was the softest thing she had felt in what felt like a lifetime. Through the open door, she watched him. He didn't tend to her, and he didn't tend to himself. He tended to his horse first. His movements were economical, precise, and sure. Only after the animal was watered, fed, and brushed down did he finally turn his attention to the cabin. The simple, ordinary domesticity of it all, the quiet care he showed the animal, made her throat tighten with an unexpected, painful emotion. Soon, a small fire crackled to life in the stone hearth, pushing back the cold and the darkness. He moved around the small space with a familiar ease, preparing a simple, hearty stew of dried meat and beans. He handed her a bowl without a word. Eat, then sleep, he ordered, settling into a rough wooden chair on the other side of the fire, his own bowl in his lap. He stared into the flames, his face a mask of shadows and light. Tomorrow the work starts. This place doesn't run itself. The days that followed blurred into a grueling, relentless rhythm of survival and learning. Garrett was not a patient teacher. He was a demanding taskmaster, his expectations as high and unforgiving as the sky above them. He didn't offer praise, only a curt nod when a task was done to his satisfaction, and a sharp, clicking sound of irritation with his tongue when she failed. He showed her how to mend a fence, his calloused hands guiding hers on the wire stretcher with a rough impatience when she fumbled. He taught her how to milk their lone, stubborn cow, a creature with a mean eye and a wicked kick. He just clicked his tongue in irritation when she was too timid, spilling the precious milk into the dirt. He didn't comfort her when she cried in frustration. He simply handed her the bucket and pointed back at the cow. Try again. The most terrifying lesson came one afternoon when he placed a rifle in her hands. The weight of it was shocking, a heavy, cold, and deadly thing. It felt alien in her grasp. Her hands, accustomed to the delicate brushstrokes of calligraphy and the smooth beads of an abacus, were clumsy and weak. Out here, you don't shoot, you die, he stated simply, his voice devoid of any emotion. It was a fundamental law of his world, like gravity or the rising of the sun. He showed her how to load it, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel, and how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. The first time she fired it, the recoil slammed into her shoulder like a mule's kick, knocking her to the ground. The sound was deafening, a crack of thunder that echoed across the empty prairie. Her ears rang, and her shoulder ached with a deep, throbbing pain. She looked up at him, expecting to see derision, or at least annoyance. Instead, he just stood over her, his expression unchanged. He ejected the spent cartridge and handed the rifle back to her. Again. Each lesson was a harsh act of empowerment. Each new skill was brutally hammered into her, chipping away at the soft, helpless woman who had collapsed at his feet and forging something new, something harder, in her place. She learned to read the sky for weather, to track animals, to skin a rabbit with a steady hand. Her own hands, once soft and pale, became calloused and scarred, a roadmap of her new life. One hot afternoon, as they sat on the porch of the cabin, cleaning and oiling the rifle parts in a comfortable, practiced silence, she finally found the courage to ask the question that had been burning inside her for weeks. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Why help me?" He didn't answer right away. He was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on the distant, hazy horizon, as if he could see something out there that was invisible to her. The silence stretched on, filled only by the buzzing of insects and the soft whisper of the wind through the grass. "This land needs a woman," he said finally, his voice a low rumble, still devoid of any sentiment. "A man alone out here for too long. He either goes mad or he gets soft. One is just as deadly as the other." He turned his head and looked at her directly then, his pale gaze intense and unnerving, stripping away all her defenses. "I've been out here 5 years. Since my wife passed. The madness is getting close." The words hit her like a physical blow. His wife. He'd had a wife. She tried to picture her, a woman living in this harsh, isolated place with this hard, silent man. He must have seen the question in her eyes because his expression tightened, a subtle shift in the weathered lines around his mouth. "She was soft," he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. From the city. She thought this was all some grand adventure. She didn't understand the land. She didn't understand that it doesn't care about your feelings. It only cares about strength. He paused, looking away again, back toward that empty horizon. "This land, It breaks soft things, Leanne. It grinds them down to dust. The chilling implication hung in the air between them. He wasn't just training her to survive, he was testing her. He was seeing if she was strong enough not to break. My wife, he continued, his voice even lower now, almost a whisper. She gave me no children. This ranch, this land, everything I've bled for, it dies with me. I need an heir. He turned his gaze back to her, and now there was a raw, undeniable fire in his eyes. It wasn't lust. It was something far more primal. It was a desperation for legacy, for continuation. You needed a way out. I need an heir. It's a fair trade. A fair trade. The cold, brutal transaction of his words stole her breath. He had saved her life, yes, but he was also claiming it. He hadn't rescued a woman. He had acquired a broodmare. She felt a surge of cold fury, but she couldn't deny the terrible, stark truth in his words. He had given her a chance to live, and now he was telling her the price. The fragile peace of their harsh bargain was shattered one morning by the sound of the dogs. It wasn't their usual barking, the sound they made when a coyote got too close to the chicken coop. This was different. It was an aggressive, frantic, furious sound. Garrett was at her side in an instant, moving from a dead sleep to full alertness in the blink of an eye. His body was coiled with a dangerous readiness, his hand already on the pistol he kept on the small table beside his cot. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice a low growl. "Don't make a sound." But Leanne didn't need to go outside to know who was there. She recognized the furious, high-pitched voice that rang out across the yard, a voice that haunted her nightmares. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. "I know she is here. The white devil has my daughter." It was her father, Mr. Wei, and he was not alone. Flanking him was the hulking, monstrous figure of Mr. Wu, his face a mask of rage. Behind them were 3 of his hired thugs, rough-looking men with cruel faces and guns in their belts. They rode into the yard as if they owned it, their horses trampling the small vegetable garden she had painstakingly planted. "We have come for what is ours," her father spat, his eyes burning with a venomous, righteous fury. Garrett stepped out onto the porch, moving into the open without any sign of fear. He stood there, calm and solid as an oak tree, his hand resting casually near the pistol at his hip. "She's not property," he said, his voice level and cold, carrying easily across the yard. "She's on my land now. That makes her my business." Mr. Wu let out a cruel, ugly laugh. It was the sound she remembered from the back rooms of Dragon's Peak, the sound that had always preceded some act of casual brutality. "A woman belongs to her father until she belongs to her husband," Wu sneered, his eyes devouring Leanne as she appeared in the doorway behind Garrett. "That is the law, our law. White man's law says she's free," Garrett replied coldly, his gaze never leaving Wu's. "And this is my land. Your laws have no power here." Here, a new voice cut through the tension, a voice that was stronger, clearer than Leanne herself would have thought possible. It was her own. "I was not taken," she said, stepping out from behind Garrett to stand beside him on the porch. The lessons of strength he had forced upon her, the confidence born of survival, echoed in every word. "I ran. I chose to leave." Her father's face purpled with rage. He looked at her as if she were a traitor, a piece of property that had suddenly and inexplicably learned to speak. "You ungrateful girl, after everything I have done for you, after I arranged such a powerful match for you. You sold me." Leanne's voice grew stronger with each word, the truth of it setting her free in a way she had never imagined. "You didn't arrange a match. You sold me to a man who finds pleasure in cruelty, a man who hurts people for sport." She gestured to Garrett, this hard, silent man who had demanded so much of her, but who had never once laid a hand on her in anger. "In these past weeks, this man has shown me what it means to be strong, what it means to survive. I choose to stay with a man who understands that." Her father's rage finally boiled over. He let out a choked scream and lunged forward, his hand raised to strike her, to slap the defiance from her face. But Garrett was faster. In a blur of motion, he caught the older man's wrist, his grip like a band of iron. Mr. Wei cried out in pain and shock. "You will not touch her," Garrett said, his voice a low, deadly growl. "Not here, not ever again. She's mine now." The words, "she's mine now," should have chilled her. They were words of ownership, of possession. But hearing them now, in the face of her father's rage and Mr. Wu's leering cruelty, they sounded like something else entirely. They sounded like protection. Mr. Wu, seeing his prize defended, let his own rage explode. He was not a man accustomed to being denied what he wanted. With a roar, he drew a pistol from his belt. But Liane was already moving, acting on pure, unthinking instinct, forged in the brutal lessons of the past weeks. Beside the cabin door stood the heavy wood axe she used for splitting firewood. She grabbed it, the familiar weight of the handle a comfort in her hand. She didn't try to swing it. She didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, she hurled it. The axe spun through the air, a glittering arc of steel, and struck Wu's horse hard on the flank. The animal screamed in pain and terror. It reared up, its front hooves lashing at the sky, throwing its rider hard to the ground. Mr. Wu landed with a sickening thud, the air driven from his lungs. In the same instant that the axe left Liane's hands, Garrett drew his own pistol. The metallic click of the hammer being cocked echoed with an unnerving loudness in the sudden, shocked silence. He leveled the gun, not at the groaning Mr. Wu on the ground, but at the two remaining thugs who were reaching for their own weapons. They froze. "The next one won't be for the horse," Garrett stated simply, his voice flat and deadly calm. "Leave. Now. Do not return." Her father, his face pale with a mixture of fear and fury, looked at Mr. Wu groaning on the ground. He looked at the two thugs, their hands held away from their guns, and he looked at Garrett, his aim steady, his eyes as cold and hard as a winter grave. He backed away, scrambling to get back on his horse. "You are dead to me, girl!" he screamed at Liane, his voice cracking with impotent rage as he wheeled his horse around. "You have chosen this white devil over your own blood." "I've chosen a life over a cage," Liane replied, her voice ringing with a newfound conviction that filled her from the soles of her feet to the top of her head. "If that makes me dead to you, then I have been dead for a very long time." The men galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy, unresolved menace hanging in the air. When they were gone, the strength that had flooded through Liane suddenly drained away, leaving her weak and shaking. The adrenaline receded, and the terror she had held at bay came rushing back in. Garrett's hand touched her elbow. It wasn't a gentle touch, not a comforting one. It was a steadying anchor in a storm. "You were brave," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I was terrified," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "Courage is not the absence of fear," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon where the men had disappeared. "It is acting despite it." He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "He'll try again." "I know," Liane said, looking at the small cabin that had become both her haven and her prison. She felt a sudden, crushing weight of guilt. "I'm sorry for bringing this trouble to you." "Stop." His voice was firm, cutting her off. "You didn't bring trouble. They did." He paused, and for the first time, he seemed to be searching for the right words, an unfamiliar struggle for the direct, pragmatic man. "You brought—" he started, then stopped. He looked at the axe lying in the dirt, then back at her. "You brought a reason to fight." That night, a violent storm rolled in, as if the land itself was mirroring the violence of the day. The sky turned a bruised, angry black. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the rain came down in hard, driving sheets. Under the cover of that howling wind and lashing rain, Mr. Wu returned. He came back with his men, and this time they carried torches. The flickering orange light cut through the darkness, a promise of fire and destruction. They meant to burn the ranch to the ground, to wipe Garrett and his claim on Leanne off the face of the earth. The first warning was a gunshot that cracked through the noise of the storm and the sound of splintering wood as a bullet tore through the barn door. Garrett moved instantly, all coiled muscle and deadly purpose. He shoved the heavy rifle into Leanne's hands. "Stay in the house. By the window," he commanded, his voice sharp and clear over the roar of the wind. "Shoot anything that isn't me or the dogs." He ran out into the storm, a ghost disappearing into the driving rain and darkness. But Leanne had learned too well what happened to women who just stayed inside and waited helplessly. She was not that woman anymore. From the window, she could see the chaos outside, illuminated by the flashes of lightning and the bobbing torches. Garrett had taken cover behind the heavy water trough, exchanging fire with the men who were using the corral fence as cover. But he was outnumbered, 3-1. Then she saw it. One of Wu's men was breaking away from the main group, sneaking around the side of the house through the darkness, a pistol in his hand. He was aiming for Garrett's exposed back. He was going to kill him. Leanne didn't hesitate. She didn't think. She acted. She steadied the rifle on the windowsill, just as Garrett had taught her. She braced the stock against her aching shoulder. She took a breath, held it, and lined up the sights on the dark shape moving through the rain. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her, and the world outside the window lit up with the muzzle flash. The man cried out, a sharp, surprised sound that was quickly swallowed by the storm, and he fell. He just crumpled to the wet ground and didn't move again. The fight was short and brutal. Leanne's shot had evened the odds and thrown the attackers into confusion. In the chaos of the storm, Garrett's intimate knowledge of his own land gave him a deadly advantage. He was a phantom in the night, moving from cover to cover, his shots precise and deliberate. Soon, the remaining men were fleeing back into the darkness, dragging their wounded leader with them, their torches extinguished, their courage broken. When it was finally over, when the only sounds were the wind and the rain, Garrett stumbled back inside the cabin. He was soaked to the bone, his face grim. A dark stain was spreading across the sleeve of his shirt. "Just a graze," he said, his voice raspy, but his face was pale in the flickering lamplight. He slumped into a chair, his body finally admitting its exhaustion. Leanne moved to him, her heart pounding. She tore strips from the bottom of her own tunic, her hands moving with a steady purpose she didn't know she possessed. She cleaned and bound the wound on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "You saved my life," he said, his voice rough as he watched her work, his eyes following her every move. "Now we're even," she whispered, tying off the bandage. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, huddled by the warmth of the fire, something shifted between them. The careful transactional distance he had always maintained was gone, washed away by the rain and the blood. It was replaced by a shared, ragged vulnerability. He was no longer just her protector or her owner. She was no longer just his ward or his future bride. They were soldiers who had survived a battle together. He flexed the fingers of his wounded arm, testing the bandage she had wrapped so tightly. "Go slow. It hurts," she moaned, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He stilled his hands immediately, his expression unreadable in the dim, dancing light of the fire. "Did I hurt you?" he asked, his voice low. "No," she clarified, shaking her head. A single tear, hot and unexpected, traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "Not the arm. My life. It's all been pain, for as long as I can remember. I don't know how to trust that this is different." He reached out with his good hand, not to her wound, but to roughly brush the tear from her face with his thumb. The gesture was clumsy, unpracticed, but it was the most tender thing anyone had ever done for her. A slow, painful smirk crossed his face. It was a look of grim acknowledgement, of shared understanding between two people who knew the language of pain all too well. "I need you to give me strong boys, Leanne," he whispered, his voice a low, fierce growl. But the words were different now. They weren't a demand. They weren't part of a transaction. He leaned closer, his pale eyes burning into hers. Boys are strong as their mother. And in that moment, she finally, truly understood. It was not a promise of love, not a vow of tenderness. It was something else. It was a vow of respect, the only kind this hard man knew how to give. He wasn't just talking about children anymore. He was talking about her. He was acknowledging her grit, her survival, her strength. He was crowning her his partner in this harsh, unforgiving world. "They'll come back," she said into the darkness, the fear still a cold knot in her stomach. "Let them," he replied, and his voice was a bedrock of certainty in the storm. "This is our home now. We'll defend it." The next morning, after the storm had passed and the world was washed clean, they found one of Wu's men. He had been wounded in the leg and left for dead by his comrades. They didn't kill him. They brought him into the cabin, and Leanne tended his wounds while Garrett stood guard with the rifle. When the man was able to ride, they put him on his own horse and sent him back to Dragon's Peak. They sent him back with a simple message. Leanne was under the protection of the rancher Garrett. She was no longer a piece of property to be bought and sold. She was the mistress of this land, and any who came to harm her or what was hers would be met with lead and fire. They knew the threat was finally over. Mr. Wu's power was built on fear and intimidation, and he had been defeated by a force more resolute, more savage than his own. He had lost face, and in a place like Dragon's Peak, that was a fate worse than death. As autumn dressed the rolling hills in brilliant shades of gold and rust, Leanne and Garrett built a new life, piece by piece. The constant, gnawing fear that had been her lifelong companion slowly began to recede, replaced by a hard-won strength and a quiet confidence. It wasn't love that grew between them, not the soft, sweet love of the stories she had read. It was something fiercer, something more elemental. It was a fierce, binding partnership, forged in shared struggle and mutual respect. They were two solitary, broken souls from two completely different worlds. They were bound not by affection, but by mutual necessity and a shared, unbending capacity for survival. They worked the land together, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. They rarely spoke of the past, or even of the future. They lived in the harsh, demanding present. One evening, as the first delicate snowflakes of winter began to fall, dusting the brown grass with a fragile layer of white, they stood together on the porch, watching the sky. He took her hand. His palm was rough and calloused against hers, a familiar and comforting texture. "This ranch needs a mistress," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet twilight. He looked at her, his pale eyes searching hers, not for love, but for agreement, for confirmation. Not a guest, not a helper, a partner. Leanne looked out at the land, her land. She looked at the sturdy cabin, her home. She looked at this hard, difficult man who had, against all odds, become her anchor. "I'm not a guest anymore, Garrett," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying in the crisp winter air. She turned to face him and squeezed his hand, a confirmation of their unspoken pact. "And I'm not a prisoner. I'm home." He nodded once, a curt, satisfied gesture that was, for him, the equivalent of a sonnet from a poet. The last shadows of his long, bitter solitude seemed to finally recede, burned away by the quiet strength of the woman standing beside him. Whatever the future held, hard winters, hostile neighbors, the relentless daily challenges of the frontier, they would meet it together, as equals, They had not found a sanctuary in each other. They had forged one together, out of blood and dust, and an unbreakable, unyielding will to endure. What do you think happened to Leanne and Garrett next? Did they find something more than just survival on that lonely ranch? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss the stories we have coming next.